Canadian society would change dramatically over the next 2 decades, and attitudes towards forests and forestry would change as a result. A post-war baby boom generation was growing up with a different set of values than their parents or grandparents. It was this younger, mostly urban generation that would play a major part in changing the way we manage our forests today.
During the 1960s and 70s, you had increasing urbanization in Canada. Persons are living more and more. Our population's living more and more in cities and urban centers. We've talked about mechanization in the forest industry, so fewer people are actually working in the forest. These towns and mills don't need that many people. The woodlands operations don't need that many people. So more and more of these folks are living in the Golden Horseshoe, or they're living in the Quebec-Windsor corridor.
The other thing that happened was, I think people started moving off the farm. So originally, if you're a farmer, you understood the value of wood. But as people started moving off the farm and into cities, they started to become disconnected from the forest.
Well, even though the forest industry remained a huge part of our economy and played a huge role in our economic well-being, the number of persons directly dependent upon it is declining at the same time as people are having a less and less direct contact with the forest.
With little direct experience of forests, it was the arrival of television into these suburban households that would first shape the attitudes of a new generation. What Canadian youth growing up in the 60s and 70s could forget the immensely popular television series The Forest Rangers, with its backdrop of scenes set in Ontario's great outdoors? Shows like these, along with films like Helicopter Canada and North of Superior, considered the most widely seen Canadian IMAX film, created a visual and highly romanticized vision of the North, a vision that would become an essential part of a generation's Canadian identity. The rapid rise of a suburban middle class with time, cars, and money meant that for the first time, many Canadians were using the forest for recreation in the new provincial and national parks. In 1954, Ontario had 8 provincial parks. By 1960, there were 72, with over 5 million visitors each year.
Once Highway 60 was constructed through the park, that really increased the number of visitors, campers, tourists coming to Algonquin Park. So it's about that time that there started to be somewhat of a conflict between recreationalists and the logging industry, who generally had free reign of most of the park before that.
Your experience with nature might be a trip to the cottage on the weekend or for 2 weeks in the summer. And during that experience, you want nature to appear as it does in your mind's eye. It's not a clear cut or a cutover. It's not stumps. It's beautiful, verdant trees that are flourishing.
Problems arose when the media constructed image of forests clashed with what people were experiencing and seeing. And the concerns were not just with Algonquin Park. Throughout cottage country and other parts of the province, young people were questioning what was happening in their forests.
And as a young man, I was quite an outdoorsman. I was out there all the time, and I saw clear cuts that were devastating. Like I remember they used to pile the logs for scaling reasons in those days. That's the measurement reasons. They piled them 16 feet high. So I would scramble up on top of a 16-foot pile in some of these clear cuts, and you could look as far as you can see. There wasn't a standing twig or tree, which the year before there had been a great forest. You didn't have to be an environmentalist, whatever that is, back in the 70s to realize something was going wrong in the forest. And that led to, in the Boreal, the huge outcry against the giant clear cuts.
The population of Canada had a right to stand up and question how these publicly owned forests were being managed. This wasn't somebody's private woodlot. This was to be held in a public trust by politicians. And so they had, everybody, I think in Canada, every citizen had a right to stand up and question what was going on and to ask for better management.
It came to confrontation in the woods because something had to change.
And they'll be replaced too. It's not going to end. We're here to stay.
Indignation and outcry grew gradually. When the confrontation came, it happened in one of Ontario's most scenic and iconic regions, an area that typified the beauty of the Canadian Shield as portrayed by Tom Thomson and other famous painters.
Algonquin Park was the battleground for so many of these disputes between loggers and recreationalists. Same in Temagami later. But these are what people would think of as old growth stands or beautiful stands. And it's interesting where they occurred because they didn't occur at that time on the boreal forest. Generally speaking, the backlash wasn't in areas that had aesthetically unpleasing trees. People weren't hugging spruce trees in blackfly-infested swamps in northern Ontario. They were in aesthetically pleasing areas that were beautiful to the eye and what they conceived of as being valuable about nature.
I think with the awakening of the environmental movement, I think that the people back then were starting to realize that the holistic view, which is something that's held by Aboriginal people, it became more important. People started to see that it was, the ecosystem was something that we were all just a small part of.
The Red Squirrel blockade of the late 1980s brought together environmental and First Nation activists in peaceful protest against the logging of Temagami's old-growth pine. At the time, the blockade was the largest act of peaceful civil disobedience in Canadian history. Over 300 people were arrested. The groups that were protesting became adept at using the media, conveying their messages in a visual way that appealed to people's emotions and tugged on their heartstrings. As a result, the protests led to broad public support for regulating the industry in a way that reflected new societal values.
Undeniably, the environmental movement was fundamental in improving our stewardship in the forest. The politicians who make the regulations governing forestry practices, they were forced because of that demographic to shift how the forest would be managed.
That movement, that whole, save the old growth and clear cutting is bad type of movement, it did two things. It really cut to the soul of a lot of forest communities who had, many generations that had grown up as loggers, and they would all have stories about how, well, my father logged in this forest. I'm going back to that forest to log it again, and my kids, I want them to follow in my footsteps. So loggers were all of a sudden evil. Foresters, the same thing. We're committed to sustainable forest management, and yet the word forester became synonymous with someone that you could not trust.
And the irony in many ways was these foresters for years had been suggesting and recommending and proposing, let's manage the forest properly, and there was a lack of political support. During the 60s, especially early 70s, you had the rise of public support for good stewardship. But at the same time, the foresters had lost their legitimacy because they were being labeled as the persons who had been part of this industrial conspiracy to harvest the forest.